Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 2024 Summer Institute. We are delighted to have all of you with us today, and we're especially pleased to have Dr. Andrew Goretsky as our speaker in honor of the Dina Grossman Memorial Lecture, which you'll be hearing a little bit more about. Thank you so much for all of you for your attendance, and now I'd like to introduce Dr. Ayal Feinberg, the Director of Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you so much, Dean Moore. Really appreciate it. Hi, everyone. I hope you're doing well. I have the unique privilege of introducing Dr. Andrew M. Goretsky, who is the Regional Director of the Anti-Defamation League's Philadelphia office, which serves Eastern Pennsylvania, Southern New Jersey, and Delaware. Andrew joined the ADL in January of 2022. Prior to joining ADL in 2022, Andrew worked in higher education administration for over 23 years. Most recently, he was Dean of Students at Arcadia University. Goretsky also served in a variety of roles at the George Washington University, serving in residential life at the University of Maryland, and led the Native American Special Interest Residential Community at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Dr. Goretsky began his career working with students with learning differences at Landmark College in Vermont. Dr. Goretsky holds a doctorate of education, specifically higher education administration, from the George Washington University, a Master of Arts in Student Personnel Administration from New York University, and a Bachelor of Science in Industrial Engineering from SUNY at Buffalo. Dr. Goretsky's dissertation researches on student engagement and mobile technology, and he has a specific interest in the proliferation of hate in online spaces, something that's quite topical today. You can find several op-eds from Dr. Goretsky in the Enquirer and other publications, and he contributed a chapter in the book called Online and Engaged, Innovative Student Affairs, Practices for Online Learner Success. Coincidentally, this book became available 2 weeks before universities shut down for COVID-19. Dr. Goretsky has also agreed to join Gratz's affiliate faculty for our new Master's in Anti-Semitism Studies program. He is working on developing a course for us for spring 2025. We have had the privilege of working together, Dr. Goretsky and I, to help generate certain anti-Semitism strategy here in Philadelphia. I can share that Dr. Goretsky is unbelievably kind, he's funny, and I'm really lucky to call him a colleague and a friend. Despite being overwhelmed with work at this moment, as we can all imagine, we are so privileged and honored to have Dr. Goretsky make time for us today. Dr. Goretsky, Andrew, I can't wait to hear your remarks, and we're all super excited to learn from you today. I just want to have a brief reminder on the Q&A and, of course, some events later on today. As it relates to Q&A, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function as we go throughout the lecture. I will be taking note of your questions, so please go ahead and make sure to do that in there. Don't raise your hand, just make sure to go in to the comment section and add what you need. And then at the Q&A point, about, let's say, 45 minutes from now, we'll have some time for Dr. Goretsky to address your responses directly, which is fantastic. If he's not able to get to some of those questions, don't worry. Dr. Goretsky has really kindly agreed to join us later today at 3:30 p.m. Eastern for a brief happy hour where we can talk in a more informal fashion. Dr. Goretsky even said he will take off his tie, as I've already modeled for everybody, so we can have the level of informality we would hope for at a happy hour. So on that note, I just wanted to say again, thank you everybody for attending. Huge thank you to Dr. Goretsky. And Dr. Goretsky, I turn the floor over to you.
Dr. Feinberg, thank you for that absolutely wonderful introduction. And taking off my tie is not a chore. I'm more than happy to do that when the time comes. I'm going to go ahead and work on sharing my screen at this moment in time. So you'll bear with me for 1 second as I make sure that And I know right now you're probably seeing my notes page, which is not what I want you to see. So one moment. Now you should see my slides. So hopefully that's what you're seeing. If you're not, if somebody could speak up and let me know, that would be fantastic. So just as once more again, this is the Dina M. Grossman Memorial Lecture in Education that was established by the Grossman family to honor the memory of their late daughter, Dina Grossman, a distinguished Jewish educator and the first graduate of Gratz's MA in Jewish Education. And I'm honored to be asked to be the speaker for this today. And I know Gratz College and myself are honored to keep Dina's memory alive so that others may benefit from and be inspired by her legacy. So again, very honored to be here and thank you. We'll be talking about fighting back anti-Semitism and hate in a world of disinformation and misinformation. A couple of things, just wanted to share with you what I intend to be the agenda for today. First, I'm going to give you an overview of ADL and my background, talk about anti-Semitism today and since 10/7. I'm going to discuss the connection between white supremacist ideology and anti-Semitism, the impact of social media, gaming, and mobile devices, talking a little bit about the ADL Center for Technology and Society's research, and then my experience with diversity, equity, and inclusion concepts, and then we'll talk about ways to engage and make a difference. Pieces of today's presentation are ADL information, and I have noted those slides with an ADL logo. Some of this is my own research as well as some of my own experience in higher education today. And I believe I've gotten all those correct throughout. So you'll take a look and see that. And as I begin the discussion today, there was a presentation that I went to at Gratz in April with the inauguration of the new Masters in Anti-Semitism program. And it was Avi Noam Pratt who spoke at the inaugurations as the keynote there about a variety of things related to anti-Semitism. And one aspect I want to emphasize that he spoke about is that we live in a disinformation age, not an information age. And that's something I've been talking about with my own research for some time. And it's an important thing to conceptualize. We also live in a world that is binary at this point, where through social media, people either like, dislike, or don't engage. And so going back and before I hit an overview of ADL, as you heard Dr. Feinberg say, I worked 23 years in higher education, student affairs, and diversity, equity, and inclusion spaces. A large part of the reason I came to ADL was twofold. First, I have a very vivid memory from the day after the Tree of Life massacre in Pittsburgh. I remember that day dropping my own son off at Hebrew school the next day. And although I had experienced anti-Semitism prior to that time, I had never experienced real fear around my own Judaism. And that was probably the first time I really experienced that fear as it relates to my own identity. The second thing that really brought me is probably since about 2005, I personally have been witnessing and seeing the rise of anti-Semitism and anti-Israel sentiment on college campuses and in the system of higher education. And those are two of amongst many reasons that I chose to transition from a career in higher education to coming and doing work at ADL at this time. Dr. Feinberg mentioned my first position, which was at Landmark College in Southern Vermont. In that role, I went from NYU to a town in Vermont where, without an exaggeration, the number of people who lived in that town were less than the building I lived in Manhattan. So it was a little bit of a culture shock. I had grown up with large Jewish communities prior to that, and I had to join a congregation that shared a cabin in the woods with the Unitarian Church. Because the congregation was that small. And when I was on campus, people would ask me, because I was one of only 2 Jewish faculty or staff members, people would ask me about the needs of all the Jewish students on campus. And my common response was, if you ask 3 rabbis the same question, you get 9 different answers. Jewish people are as diverse as any other identity group. I will be sharing with you perspectives from research, perspectives from ADL, some of my own personal perspectives, but you'll hear different things from different Jewish individuals, and I think that's just an important concept as we go into the discussion today. I'm going to go very quickly through ADL's mission, just for those of you who may not be familiar with the Anti-Defamation League. We are a national anti-hate organization founded in 1913 to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment to all, because our founders knew then what we know now. You can't fight one form of hate and bigotry without fighting all forms of hate and bigotry. And I would be remiss if I did not comment as we talk about fighting hate back in all spaces. Later in this presentation, I will be discussing white supremacist ideology as it relates to anti-Semitism. We've seen violence as it relates to that. Yesterday, we saw the attempted assassination of former president who is running for office again. And in that attempted assassination, we've seen political violence. And political violence is never, ever an acceptable response, whether it was the January 6th insurrection on the Capitol or an attempted assassination yesterday. And I'm just hope and pray that as a country, we can continue to do better and tone down the rhetoric, which is a lot of what, when we talk about fighting against hate, is an important aspect to do. So what does ADL do? We fight anti-Semitism. Obviously, we have our Center for Anti-Semitism Research, which does a big component of this. We have a Center on Extremism, which monitors extremist activity, puts out information about extremist activity, gives information to law enforcement. As a matter of fact, there's an individual who was committing bomb threats to Jewish institutions here in the Philadelphia region. It was through our Center on Extremism and our incident response that we were able to give information to the FBI, and the person who was responsible for that is actually facing 50 years in prison and has been indicted in that process. So our Center on Extremism is fighting extremist violence and potential for violence on a daily basis. We have our Center for Technology and Society, which is doing work both from a policy and legislative end and intervention end to fight, disrupt, and fight online hate. We advocate at the local, federal, and global level for advocacy. We've done that in the past. We do that now. For those of you who are here in Pennsylvania, we have been working on improving our hate crime legislation in this state as a focus of this particular region. And then we challenge bias and discrimination. We do that through education, our No Place for Hate programs. We have 25 regional offices across the country. In my office, we have an operations team, an education team, and a development team. That development team raises our funds in order to keep our doors open and do the work that we need to do. Our education team is providing anti-Semitism workshops, No Place for Hate programming, youth conference, and resources online. Our operations team is responding to incidents, helping to educate law enforcement on anti-Semitism and anti-bias work. Advocacy and media are many of the things that we are engaging in from an operations end. And what guides our work is our pyramid of hate and understanding the architecture of bigotry. Hate is a progressive process that can be interrupted. It is a learned phenomenon that can be unlearned. And that's the good news here, is that there are interventions at any level. But it begins with the normalization of less damaging forms of bias, which lays a foundation upon which acts of bias, discrimination, and eventually violence can grow if unchecked. ADL believes that hate needs to be confronted at all levels of the pyramid, and each level requires specific and targeted intervention. We want to target bias attitudes and acts of bias with education. We want to target discrimination and bias-motivated violence with legal action and legislation. Bias-motivated violence is what we do at our Center on Extremism and through law enforcement. And obviously, we are working to avoid the pinnacle of this, which is genocide. So talking about anti-Semitism today, again, giving a brief overview of this, it is a form of prejudice that's directed towards Jews as individuals, as a group. It's based on stereotypes and myths. One of the reasons that anti-Semitism persists throughout the centuries and millennia is it is based upon a series of conspiracy theories that evolve over time. and it evolves to that particular day. So whatever the issue is of that moment, when people feel anxiety, when people feel fear and concern, they're often targeting minority groups. And Jews have often been that minority group that's targeted with whatever trouble there is at that moment. We do consider delegitimizing, demonizing, or applying a double standard to Israel as anti-Semitic. Anti-Semitism was a coin termed in the 1870s. And then anti-Semitism can also be given to people who aren't Jewish but are perceived as Jewish. There was a professor out west who was attacked based on the fact that the student thought that that individual was Jewish. And we've seen a massive rise. One of the things that ADL does since 1979, we put out our audit of anti-Semitic incidents. You can see from 2014 to 2023 what has been an exponential increase. I'm going to show the impacts of post 10/7 in a moment, but understanding the urgency of and addressing anti-Semitism requires addressing the state of anti-Semitism across the United States. And so we've seen this 873% increase. We can take a look at that map of the different states. The orange is 250 plus incidents. The dark blue is between 101 and 249, and then they go down from there. One of the things I can also tell you, though, is that these incidents still go grossly underreported. I do not go to a single speaking engagement. I do not go to a single event where at least one person doesn't come up to me afterwards and discuss an incident that happened to them that they didn't report to somebody. We know hate crimes in general go underreported, and we also know that incidents of anti-Semitism still go underreported despite the exponential increase. And when we look at the rise nationally, we can see in 2023, we were already on an upward trend, but you can look at that data on the left bar graph. Beginning in October, we saw a more than tripling of the previous month in September of incidents through October, and that stayed consistent through November and December. And I can tell you that unfortunately, 2024 is trending in this direction too. I know we have individuals from all around the world, but sharing at least one of my own states, in Pennsylvania, we saw an increase of 114 anti-Semitic incidents in 2022 to an increase of 394 in 2023. Even of greater concern is we actually went from 0 anti-Semitic assaults in 2022 to 5 anti-Semitic assaults in the state of Pennsylvania in 2023. And those in Pennsylvania all occurred to K through 12 age children. And 4 of those happened in either a school or a school bus setting. And I will also note that 4 of the 5 of those actually occurred before October 7th. So anti-Semitism has been on the rise for some time, and then it went up exponentially on October 7th. And I can tell you that my staff here locally, on October 7th, we were reaching out to local law enforcement throughout the state of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and Delaware, asking them to increase patrols around Jewish institutions and mosques as well, because we knew from May 2021 Israel-Gaza conflict that it resulted in greater levels of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia here. And so we were calling up law enforcement, asking them to increase patrols for both institutions, because regardless of what's happening over there, it is no excuse for hate and any form of extremist hate here in the United States. And so surges and incidents, obviously the Israel-Hamas war, we have seen a greater level of organization around white supremacist ideology, propaganda activity, K through 12 schools, college campuses. Many of the assaults are on individuals who are visibly Jewish. We also in 2023 saw an inordinate number of bomb threats that occurred to Jewish institutions, not just in my region, but across the country. And I'm not going to go into a whole history of anti-Semitic tropes, but just looking at this slide, you can see these are very typical tropes throughout the course of history. Power, the idea that Jews have a secret power to benefit themselves at the expense of others. Disloyalty, the idea that Jews are more loyal to themselves rather than the countries in which they reside. greed, the idea that Jews will try to enrich themselves by any means, deicide, the idea that Jews were responsible for the death of Jesus, blood libel, which is the idea that Jews use Christian blood, particularly the blood of children, in their rituals. We see this trope play out in conspiracy theories around QAnon and other locations. Holocaust denial, post 10/7, we've seen a lot of 10/7 denial around the atrocities that have occurred on that day. Disease, and then anti-Zionism. Anti-Zionism meaning that it's calling for the destruction of the state of Israel. When you call for the destruction of the state of Israel and deny Jews the right to self-determination, that is what we do consider to be anti-Semitic. And before I talk about anti-Semitic attitude survey, I just want to share a little bit of a personal story here. I think that personal stories help to bring anecdotes and information to understanding pieces. I entered college at SUNY Buffalo in 1991. I joined that university, and I became friends with this guy from rural New York who grew up on a farm and never interacted with a Jewish person in his life. We hung out for the first couple of weeks. We get to the third week, and he says, "Andrew, do you want to hang out this weekend?" And I said, "No, I can't. I'm going home for Rosh Hashanah." And he looked at me and he said, "Rosh Hashanah, what's that?" He didn't even know what it was. And I said, "Well, it's the Jewish New Year." And he looked at me dumbfounded. And he said, "You're Jewish?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "But you can't be." I said, "No, I'm pretty sure. I've gone through Hebrew school. I've done the whole 9 yards, got bar mitzvah. I'm quite confident I'm Jewish." He goes, "But it's impossible." I'm like, "Why is it impossible?" He said, "Because Andrew, you don't have horns." So he grew up in a town where at some point, somebody, when he went to church, said that Jews wear hats or yarmulkes because we are hiding our demon horns. This is a perpetuation of the deicide trope. This is the demonizing and dehumanizing of Jews. And I bring it up because one of the things that our anti-Semitic attitude survey tests for is a variety of different tropes around Jews, and it tests for 11 different categories of tropes. In 2019, the study showed that 11% of Americans believed in 6 or more. 2022 it was up to 20%, and in 2024 it was up to 24% of Americans believe in 6 or more anti-Jewish tropes. Now, that statement about horns is clearly an anti-Semitic statement. Is he anti-Semitic? No, he's not. He was open to that education. We are still friendly to this day. And it's one of those pieces where he chose to learn, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment. But I think it's just important. The reason why this 6 or more anti-Jewish tropes is important is it's at that 6 or more level where we start seeing true anti-Jewish hate. So somebody may believe 1 or 2 stereotypes. They may believe 1 or 2 stereotypes of other identity groups. As it relates to anti-Judaism, the true anti-Jewish hate begins at this 6 or more when people believe that, which is why that number is particularly important. Now, the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you a few images that are disturbing. I apologize for that, but it's impossible to have this conversation without those. And so in looking at different pieces, first you'll see this is artwork from Renaissance, Middle Ages, anti-Semitic myths about blood libel then. We see Jewish clergy bloodletting from a Christian individual in order to use it in matzahs. We see in other Jewish rituals, we see that again in the picture on the right. And what I'm going to show you is how this has evolved to today in criticism of Israel. And to be very clear, criticizing Israel or the Israeli government is inherently not anti-Semitic in and of itself. But when you use anti-Semitic tropes, when you demonize, when you delegitimize, that's where it crosses the line to being anti-Semitic. And here are some blood libels from recent history. We see in the upper left corner, we don't even have an Israeli flag. It's a Jewish star with a bib cutting into a person wearing a keffiyeh. We have a racist caricature in the upper right-hand corner of an individual biting into a child with a shirt that's in a Palestinian flag, again with a Jewish star and a yarmulke on. We have a meat grinder with somebody with a Jewish star and an armband. And this is how much of these tropes then evolve and are utilized to be anti-Semitically critical of Israel. Thinking about anti-Semitic myths of power and control and this exorbitant amount of control that Jews allegedly have, this has often been portrayed in media through puppetry. You see in the far right is a Jewish person puppeteering with puppets of FDR, Churchill, and Stalin over World War II, used as propaganda about Jewish power, puppeteering. And here are some from recent past where we've got a racist caricature of a Jewish person in the upper left corner with puppets of Obama and Biden. We have in the lower left corner Netanyahu puppeteering Donald Trump. In the middle, we have a Jewish person puppeteering Arab leaders. In the upper right corner is a racist caricature of Netanyahu with relation to US and EU. And so, if you're critical of Israel and its policies and governments, that's one thing. But when you're being anti-Semitically critical, that's when it crosses the line. And I did want to share just how anti-Semitism is adaptive on two particular slides here, and share why these ones are considered anti-Semitic. First, when you look at the one on the left, you have a racist caricature of a Jewish person who's telling the kids that they need to give money to Israel. And this one's implying that the reason that federal poverty programs aren't funded is because Jews are taking the money to go to Israel. And when you look at the one on the right, you see an individual being run over because military aid's going to Israel, the only Jewish state, implying that the reason you're only getting a $600 COVID check is because of all this money going to Israel. There are lots of reasons why government or Congress or legislative bodies or policymakers may choose to fund one program or multiple programs or over another. But the reason that somebody may not have federal poverty program money or extra COVID relief dollars is not because only things are going to Israel or Jews are taking that money. There is money that goes to many, many different things. And so when you are blaming the only Jewish state or Jews for this, that is crossing the line to being anti-Semitic. So I want to talk a little bit about connection to white supremacist ideology. So being in higher ed and having worked in higher ed back in 2017, I often watched anything happening on a campus. And so I was watching very intently what was happening at the Unite the Right rally at the University of Virginia. And just as a reminder, this rally was about taking down and protesting the taking down of Confederate statues. And I remember watching this on the news and hearing individuals say and chant, "Jews will not replace us." And I was floored. I was like, is that really what they're chanting? Why is it that they're chanting, "Jews will not replace us"? And I didn't quite understand that. And that's when I started doing research and was really then dove deep into ADL's work, because it was then that I learned about the Great Replacement conspiracy theory. This is the conspiracy theory that white society is being replaced by Black and brown people, and that there is this powerful cadre, an exorbitant power of Jewish people spearheading that. This idea, this Great Replacement conspiracy theory, is the conspiracy theory that the murderer used in his justification for choosing to shoot up the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh. He was concerned that those Jewish people were spearheading this replacement of white America. It's also the same ideology that the individual who chose to shoot up a Tops supermarket in Buffalo, in that case, he chose to target a majority Black community. But both of these individuals were utilizing this conspiracy theory, which is completely false and untrue, in order to justify. We see where hateful rhetoric, when unchallenged, can lead to bias and can lead to violent acts. And ADL does track national data as it relates to white supremacist propaganda. The purpose of white supremacist propaganda is to intimidate minority communities, as well as to perpetuate the ideology and to recruit new people. So much of this may fall under free speech and may not be illegal behavior, but we track it because it's important to be able to share with communities the impact that this propaganda may be having. So we've talked about anti-Semitism. We've talked about the connection to white supremacy. I want to talk a little bit about the impact of online engagement, social media, gaming, and mobile devices. Much of this next section comes from my own research, as well as the Center for Technology and Society. I'm going to go through a few photos first, just to show some evolution. And I'm coming back to this one for a moment. And this is now over a decade ago, that 2013. I want to get one for 2024 and see what we're looking at now. It may be, 10 years from now, we may have people sending their robots with their artificial intelligence in their screens rather than even going to themselves. But this is really, I think, a telling sign of how engagement and interaction has changed, whether it's in person, whether it's virtual. And for those of you especially in the higher education program, my research on student engagement and mobile technology, much of the development theories that we learned in higher education were developed when students, at least traditional age students, went away to college. So they were there on their bricks and mortar campus, and they were really separated from the world. And so my research was trying to examine, how does the fact that a student who's at college can draw on information from anywhere in the world at any time and can contact any person in the world impact how they engage in the classroom setting, on campus, etc. And for today's discussion, I wanted to share some key findings from my research. The first one is the school of planning ahead is no longer socialized. One of the things we've often seen is traditional age students having difficulty either making a plan and following through. Part of what my findings had shown is that challenge here is that the devices enable us to enact in a different way. So an example that I'll discuss here is when I was in high school and I wanted to meet with friends, I had to pick a time, a location, and show up. Once mobile devices came, I could either call you and say, "Where are you?" Back in my day, before I went to college, nobody said that when they picked up the phone because they knew where you were. If they were in your home, you were on some landline with a cord. Now you can text people where they are. But the need to make a plan and follow through is no longer there. There was a natural consequence when I was in high school. If I didn't show up on time, if I didn't make that plan, follow through, and show up on time, I didn't get to hang out with my friends. And I think that there was a lot of socialization into this type of idea of planning ahead and following through. So I don't know that we've ever actually significantly taught it. And so we have to think about if this is still an important skill to be teaching it, but it's really this impact of just-in-time information. So not only is that the component, but there's an urgency and frustration that appears from missing out, because with our devices, we're getting constantly just-in-time information, and we're looking for things in the moment. And even as we think about the assassination attempt on former President Trump yesterday, there's already a number of conspiracy theories coming out there. So before anybody's had a chance to look into it, before anybody's had a chance to investigate it, people are getting information out there, and people are looking for that information, and they may be swayed or believe it. And I do want to differentiate between two terms here. Disinformation is the information that somebody puts out with the intention of falsifying information and swaying viewpoints. Misinformation is when I see that disinformation, I believe that disinformation, and out of good intentions in order to help others, I spread that, and that's misinformation. And one of the best things we can do to fight back disinformation and misinformation online is to teach our students, teach ourselves, and teach society Make sure you know your source before you share something. Make sure you understand where that information is coming from, which is one of the reasons why here at the ADL, our Center on Extremism looks to put accurate information out as quickly as possible. Other findings, the interaction with the external community affects how students engage on campus. We balance mobile device usage as both engagement and distractive. That's clearly visible here in this 2013 photo, where people are engaged, but they're busy filming it rather than possibly really engaging in the material. And I wonder how many people, every time they record these things or take pictures of it, actually look at it later. So they're not as engaged, and then they're doing this. And then one of my findings is university response to mobile devices need to be high quality and fast. But who is first has impact. It's not necessarily the correct impact. It's not necessarily the right impact. It's not necessarily accurate impact. But who is first does have impact. Dualistic thinking in the age of social media, for those of you who've studied higher ed, Perry's theory of dualism. In the initial stage, students will see the world in black and white terms. Knowledge is viewed as absolute. Multiplicity is when students begin to recognize that there are multiple perspectives on an issue. And relativism is at this stage, students understand that knowledge is contextual and relative. And so we're going to talk about this binary because one of the things that I think we continue to see with social media is this staying in this dualistic phase, this staying in a binary of like, dislike, or don't engage. And when we think about dualistic thinking in the age of social media, typically when people are angry or frustrated, there's usually a cooling off period before people can talk about it. But social media does not enable this to occur. Feedback on it tends to enhance current emotional states. And an example I did through my own research in higher ed is just even understanding a roommate conflict. So when I was in college, if I had a conflict with my roommate, I'd complain to one or two people on the floor. By the time I get in with a staff member, I had only complained to one or two people. I could entertain the idea of compromise. I could also entertain the idea that I might have had some responsibility in that. Now what happens in a roommate conflict? In a roommate conflict today, I post it on Facebook or Instagram or Snapchat it to my friends. I text my mom and dad. In my mom's case, she would have said I was absolutely right and my roommate was wrong. And so we continue to have this constant reinforcement, and all that happens in less than 10 minutes. And so by the time I got in with a staff member in today's day and age, I can't even entertain the idea of compromise, let alone that maybe I contributed to it. And this is the unfortunate power of disinformation and misinformation as it relates to Israel and the Hamas conflict. People are seeking out information that that reinforces their own viewpoints. People are seeking out information if they are looking for something anti-Semitic to reinforce their anti-Semitic and or racist viewpoint. And then the algorithms are actually feeding that back. And so ADL's Center for Technology and Society does a number of particular pieces of research. We have a hate online study. We saw this past year the significant increase in Twitter and X specifically as it relates to anti-Semitic post frequency. But the key findings from this were first that young people experienced more harassment this year. 3/4 of teens and preteens experienced harassment in online multiplayer games, up from 67% in previous years. We also saw that women and Black or African American gamers were the most harassed because of their identity in online multi-gamer environments. And though still far too high, the overall of harassment of adults in online multiplayer games decreased for the first time in 5 years from 76% down from 86%. So it did go down a little bit, but we're still seeing a very high amount. And 70% of Jewish adults experience some form of harassment in online games as well, and exposure to white supremacist ideologies. And so when all of this is out there, what is challenging that viewpoint? how are we helping people learn from that and understand that that information is not accurate? And part of it really needs to be not just us teaching that, but we need social media platforms and gaming platforms to take a greater responsibility in managing and monitoring their content. I'm not going to go over all this, but we do have an online Holocaust denial report card in particular that looks at that particular component of gaming systems as well as online social media. Um, we also did a project with the Tech Transparency Project and the ADL Center for Technology and Society, where ADL tested the personas of different ages and genders who searched for or looked for conspiracy theories on topics. We found that Meta-owned Instagram recommended accounts spreading the most virulent and graphic anti-Semitic content identified in the study to a 14-year-old test persona who engaged with the platform's recommendations. Instagram's AI's power search prediction feature also did that, but we did find that YouTube was the only platform examined in the study that did not recommend anti-Semitic content to the test personas, which shows that it is possible for platforms to tune algorithms to avoid exacerbating anti-Semitic hate. Brief overview of some DEI concepts that come out of my time in higher ed and working in that realm. First is this concept of intent over impact. When the outcome does more harm than good, it can prove hard to assume that the best intentions when there's no trust between the producer and the perceiver. But the core of the difference between intent to impact is the relationship between the two. And I will say after 10/7, I had DEI professionals in the field call me from my old higher ed days and ask if they could talk with me about Israel-Gaza conflict without offending me. And I said I couldn't promise that I wouldn't be offended, but for those individuals, I knew where their heart was. So I was able to have that conversation. But we do need to understand and emphasize impact over intent. This next is really in an understanding of a variety of identity development theories, as well as my own experiences. And this can be applied to any ism, whether it's racism, whether it's anti-LGBTQ hate. And the idea is that people are somewhere along this spectrum, and we want to take actions to move them further to the right towards inclusion. My person that I mentioned in college who thought I had horns, that would completely obviously be to the left of tolerance. Now, how I reacted to him could have made him say, okay, Jewish people don't have horns, but they're jerks. And sometimes I use more expletive language than that, but since we're in a presentation, I won't today. And so, you know, our goal in anything is to try to get people through education, through conversation, to move towards inclusion. Another concept you'll hear about in DEI circles is this oppressor-oppressed dynamic. As we've reinforced this concept of the binary, I am a huge supporter of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. However, I've also said, like many places in human systems, there are problems and challenges. And the oppressor-oppressed dynamic and the binary associated with this in the binary age, it places Jews and Israel as solely the oppressors, when that is not necessarily accurately the case. And we see that anti-Semitism and social justice, one, we see from Eric Ward, who's a civil rights activist, that within social and economic justice movements committed to equality, we've not yet collectively come to terms with the centrality of anti-Semitism to white nationalist ideology. And one of the things I've been talking about since joining ADL and through my interview process is Jewish culture and anti-Semitism has been left out of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And it's easy to be anti-Semitically critical of Israel and think you're not anti-Semitic if we don't understand Jewish identity. Jewish identity on campuses also often fall under campus ministries, but Jewish identity goes beyond religion. It's an ethnicity. It's a nation. Can you be an atheist Jew? If I do consider myself an agnostic Jew. If I'm honest about it, I'm probably an atheist Jew. I just don't want to be wrong when I die. But, you know, it's one of those pieces where it's a strong identity for many individuals, including myself. We are a racialized identity. We're not race in the consideration of American racism, but in Nazi Germany and in other locations, we have been racialized. We were a people. But again, if you think of Judaism as only a religion, then it's easy to be anti-Semitically opposed to Israel while thinking you're not anti-Semitic. And we will be wrapping up shortly, but I want to talk about how we engage and information to help us along and to give people a little bit of a taste of some of the things we can talk about and we'll be able to talk about in the advocacy track in the Masters in Anti-Semitism program, is this concept of the spectrum of allies. And in America, one of the things we often do, we want to convince people we're right. And in this binary world, we want to convince you to come to our side of the argument. And one of the things I encourage people to do is to think about when you're engaging somebody, where are they on this? So are they an active opponent to your view? So do they believe, say, in the Israel-Gaza conflict, that Israel should, for me, if they're an active opponent, then they think Israel should be destroyed? Are they a passive opponent? So they think it should be an activist, they think it should be destroyed and they're protesting, they're out there speaking against it. Passive opponent, they don't like Israel, they think it probably shouldn't exist, but they're not out there about it. Neutral, they're not certain what they think. Passive allies, they agree with me, but they're not willing to be vocal. And active allies are out there speaking about it and connecting with it and talking about that narrative. We need to consider moving people one notch on this. When we try to move people from active opponents to active allies, we actually can have the unintentional consequence of pushing them further away. Whereas we can achieve the goals we want by moving people forward. Imagine the person who is purely neutral at this point and becoming an ally and more passive about it. They may be speaking about it in circles and in their personal circles. A passive ally may not be an activist out there, but if you can convince them to be an activist, they will come out and be an activist for your cause. And when we think about advocacy and the politics of it, this is something to really consider and think about, and happy to talk more when we get to the happy hour later this afternoon. Improving online engagement. Tech companies need to fix the product features that currently escalate anti-Semitism. The predictive autocomplete features specifically in the auto generation of hate and anti-Semitism altogether. Again, we saw YouTube has the ability to do this. Other platforms have not, so the capability is there. We need them to do it, and we need to regulate to do it. We need to update Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act to fit the reality of today's internet. It was enacted before social media and search platforms were in place, and it basically gives no responsibility legally to social media platforms. And then we need more transparency. Users need to know how the algorithms work and how those things move. And then because I come from campus, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about just briefly the things that ADL is asking in Not on My Campus in fighting anti-Semitism. We want administrators to speak forcefully against anti-Semitism, rigorous enforcement of student and faculty disciplinary rules and non-discrimination and anti-harassment policies, investigating anti-Israel and anti-Zionist student groups, creating task forces and advisory groups focused on campus anti-Semitism, updating security protocols, and conducting trainings that incorporate anti-Semitism into DEI awareness. We have a report card that came out, which has been evaluating campuses and how they're doing, open letters to administrators, engagement opportunities for students and alumni online, and we've also had to enact some campus legal line information. And I think I have gone a little bit over, but that is the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions.
Well, thank you, Andrew. That was a wonderful, comprehensive presentation, and my goodness, I'm sure we have lots of questions that we're going to try to squeeze in. But I'm going to take point of privilege here and ask you the first one. When you showed us the pyramid of hate that the ADL has, you spoke about different interventions that we have at each level. And I'm hoping maybe, especially given the large proportion of educators that we have in our audience today, you can speak to one approach that could possibly be incorporated into curriculum for our student educators.
So I think that there's a couple of pieces in there. I think first and foremost into curriculum, We've really have to be incorporating into all aspects of curriculum accurate information and inaccurate information and disinformation and misinformation. I know in higher education, we often talk about research and validity of information, but as higher ed, one of the challenges in higher education is we are no longer the owners of and sole owners of the creation of knowledge. There are many creators of knowledge out there that are creating many pieces of invalid information. So I would articulate that in curriculum, providing opportunities for students to be able to evaluate whether something is valid or invalid as they are working on whatever they're working on is something that's important to learn from a curricular perspective. The other piece from an intervention perspective that I would say in curriculum, and this is obviously not going to be a concern here at Gratz, but I think is a concern at many colleges and universities, is this concept that Jewish culture and anti-Semitism has been left out of diversity, equity, and inclusion work. I can get into and do a whole lecture specifically on that. The brief of it from my own experience perspective is that the focus, at least in the last 5 to 6 years, has been more heavily on the equity portion of diversity, equity, and inclusion belonging, and not on the diversity and inclusion and belonging aspects. So those are a couple of things to keep in mind.
Thank you so much for that answer, Andrew. Great question here from one of our students. When encouraging active allyship, so thinking about this being one notch from passive allyship, what responsibility do we have regarding our students and our student safety, and how can we be careful about urging conduct and getting them actively engaged, but understanding possible consequences of that?
So active engagement can look different ways. I think sometimes people think active engagement means I'm going to go out there and be part of a counter protest, or I'm going to be part of a protest. And that's not necessarily active engagement. Me being here talking about this in a webinar is active engagement. Providing that opportunity for people to learn and discuss it is there. Passive allies are individuals who believe it but won't even speak out. And we have to understand, the reality is, and I'm going to put my old Dean of Students hat on for a moment. So I'm going to take my Regional Director of ADL hat off and put my old Dean of Students hat on. One of the things I often told students, if they were planning a counter rally to something that was happening, I encourage them to do it at a different time and a location. Now, there are people who disagree with me on that. They think it needs to be at the same place and time. But from a escalation perspective, there's greater potential for that when it's in the same location. And so as a former dean of students, it's one of the things I always recommended was one of those components. The other piece too is just thinking through, only go as far as you feel safe and comfortable. So we want to encourage people to be active allies, and we want to do that, and there's also safety in groups. So finding like-minded individuals, bringing people into that conversation and engagement is one of the things that can help.
Thanks, Andrew. We have 2 questions that I'm going to tie together here. One of our faculty members brought up some statistics related to higher education bills targeting and eliminating DEI programs at this moment. 14 of such bills have become law. There are another 14 that are awaiting signatures from governors. Absolutely, your experience is paramount here because you are acknowledging some shortcomings as it relates to DEI, but simultaneously you understand the importance of the DEI structure and how it empowers certain individuals and groups. So, how do we navigate these issues? Is there a way to save DEI, revise DEI? That can make it less toxic and political. And related to that, I think this really gets at the heart of some of the concerns related to progressive Jews that feel really abandoned by the progressive movement at this moment. So if you can squeeze in that as well, I know that's a complicated question, but then I can check off a few of these boxes in the
fair enough. And if I don't hit a box sufficiently, I'm happy to come back to a part of it. We could probably do an entire 8-hour lecture on this and still not hit all the pieces of it. So I think the place to start here is, I will say, the sixth point on ADLs not on my campus is to incorporate anti-Semitism and Jewish culture into DEI programs. So as an organization, we are not calling for the elimination of DEI. That being said, there's actually a really good author, somebody I reviewed for my literature review for my research, Arthur Levine, who wrote a book called Generation on a Tightrope. And one of the things he says in there is that the reason that a lot of our systems of government, education, and others feel like they are failing is because they were designed for an analog, nationalistic, industrial society, not for the digital, global, information-based society we are in today. And I bring that up because human beings are fallible. And so, one, we can create systems that maybe have problems with them to begin with, or we create systems that don't work as society evolves. DEI as a concept has done massive good for many people in creating positive outcomes. It has also created a space that has further marginalized Jewish individuals, remembering that 25% of Jews in America are not white, remembering that 60 to 70% of the descendants of Jewish people in Israel are descendant from North Africa and the Middle East, and not descendant from Europe. So there's a lot of equation and assumptions that happen there, which is why there needs to be improvement and changing. Eliminating it could potentially harm some of the good that, and much of the good that has happened. And so the question is, how do we do that? And this is where we've got to look for information. There's a op-ed piece written by a colleague of mine in St. Louis. So he's the regional director of St. Louis. He wrote a piece with and co-authored it with the president of the NAACP in St. Louis that talks about not looking at the Israel-Gaza conflict through the eyes of American racial oppression. Unfortunately, and I'm going to be very clear here, unfortunately, those people who are anti-Israel, and I'm going to differentiate that from pro-Palestinian, because as I wrote in an op-ed of mine, I want peace, prosperity, and dignity for both Israelis and Palestinians, and I want the Hamas terrorist threat eliminated. And so when we think about DEI and other components, there is this binary that if I'm one thing, I have to be the other. And when we look at this component, individuals have unfortunately falsely equated American racial oppression with the political dynamics of what's going on in Israel, and that's just not accurate. I'm not an Israel political expert, so I would need to defer to those on that, but that's my take on that. And so with DEI, I think we need to look at how do we improve it, how do we change it, how do we incorporate different pieces, but we wouldn't throw out banks altogether because the banking system isn't working. We need to look at how we improve it, regulate it, and manage it.
That's a fantastic answer. And yeah, I'm giving you these hard questions, Andrew, because I know that this is only going to make sure that your course in the spring when we launch it will have full enrollment. So I really appreciate these concise, great answers to really complicated questions here. And also, let me tell you, I think we're in agreement, even though we don't share the same research background as somebody who cares deeply about measurement, right? Hearing that binaries lack nuance, right, is absolutely something that we need to be tackling and through graduate education. So fantastic. I'm going to squeeze in one more question. I know we're a little bit over time, and we have things to attend to in about 13 minutes from now. But I want to give Andrew one last question here from one of our students. This student is Jewish and grew up in a very rural area, and wants to know if you have any recommendations for people experiencing anti-Semitism in an environment where they don't have an obvious community to turn to.
So this is partly the power of online media. Students who live in a direct community where they don't have that, even though there are challenges with our current online and internet day and age, you can find communities to engage with others. One of the things that I would actually recommend coming out of something from the chapter I had written about campus and engagement would be to create an online platform for other Jewish people from rural communities. Because specifically engaging with me when I lived in rural Vermont, and my experience with that is a little bit different than engaging with me when I was a Jewish person living in Manhattan, going to NYU, or now that living in Philadelphia. And so there's going to be opportunities, whether it's through different national organizations or others, that you can connect with to try to connect with other Jewish people in rural settings in particular, because you'll have some common ground to speak about as you try to assist each other through it. That would be my thought.
Thank you so much, Andrew. Really, really appreciate your time, your expertise. For those of us in Philly, we're especially lucky to have your advocacy. And for all of us at Gratz, very excited to have your research and your experience become a part of our programming more frequently moving forward. So thank you very much. For those of you, we have a couple of unanswered questions. Maybe people will loosen up and ask some more when they have a drink in hand later at the happy hour. So please make sure to join us for that. Andrew has really graciously agreed to give us a little bit more of his time this afternoon. So please make sure to attend for something a bit more casual. Big round of applause. I know we're in webinar format, Andrew, so you're just going to have to imagine our 60 plus participants here clapping and appreciating you. Thank you so much. Thank you, Honor, right, for coming in and demonstrating that. Thank you so much for your time, Andrew.